This is the Greg Bedard Patriots Podcast with Nick Caddles.
Greg, I know you've said that Vrabel's going to take his time with this offensive coordinator search, but I got to be honest here.
I didn't think there's so much time.
I was going to say, I'm surprised that there's not a single name being leaked and that there's no interview requests being sent out. I thought we'd have at least a couple of names at this point. What's going on?
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I could tell you, Nick. This is odd. I think you noted that he said something about it as a press conference, like this afternoon, we're going to be doing like, X, Y, and Z, or at least getting going on this, including perhaps talking to some people. I really don't understand what's going on. And, normally, these types of things, like, the national people are going to own this stuff as far as like the news leaking and stuff like that, because they have relationships with these agents and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's, sort of a warehouse for them. It's, fine, whatever. But I don't know. Maybe, maybe Mike Vrabel had a tropical vacation lined up, maybe a vow renewal with his wife. Maybe he went down to see Drake May himself. I don't know, but I assume we're going to get going here. Yeah, I'm surprised. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, and Vrabel said on Tuesday morning with Greg Hill that he was going to start talking to people on Tuesday. So, we're 48 hours later here. And then I sent the Judge Judy gif on Twitter last night of like her slapping the desk and pointing to her watch. Like, what? I'm waiting for information here. Of course, I think this came out after we did our podcast earlier in the week, but Tommy Reese, right? This came out after. Tommy Reese is staying in Cleveland as their offensive coordinator. Could that have messed up anything as far as Vrabel's process here?
Yeah, it's very possible, but I gotta tell you, I'm, and it sounded like there's a guy out of Chicago who used to be in the Bears front office. I think his name's Greg Gabriel. He's on Twitter, and he's pretty plugged in with the Bears front office. And he tweeted at some point that basically he was hearing that Tommy Reese would be Vrabel's offensive coordinator, or was the favorite, and he was happy about that. That the Bears avoided Mike Vrabel for that reason. Look, I think a lot of Tommy Reese. I think he's got a lot of potential. All the coaches that he's worked under, whether it's Notre Dame or Nick Saban or Kevin Stefanski, they all talk about how smart he is, and I'm sure he is. But I am not putting Drake May's future in the hands of a 32, 33-year-old offensive coordinator who's never really coached the quarterback position, certainly not at the NFL level. And so, but I do think because Greg said that and he's so connected to the Bears, Vrabel must have said that in his Bears interview. So yes, I do think that probably has complicated things.
I'm a Notre Dame fan, as many of you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be fair to Tommy Reese because it was his first OC gig. I was not a big fan of his play calling at all at Notre Dame. I did not think he was necessarily great as a play caller. Again, things have changed. He then went to Alabama. He worked with Jalen Milroe. He then went to Cleveland. So, people evolve. People get better at what they do.
Yep.
So maybe he would have been better if he was here next season. I didn't love it based off of my experience watching his offenses. I know he had Ian Book and he had some limited weapons as well. So that also plays a role. But I didn't love what I saw. And I agree with you. He's 32. He just doesn't have a ton of experience. And I know he played quarterback, but he hasn't worked with NFL quarterbacks at all. So, yeah, I was not in love with the idea of Tommy Reese. And that was before he decided to stay in Cleveland. He was not one of those guys that I said, oh, you got to bring him in. You've got to make that happen. Of course, people want to know, every time we talk about OC, what's the latest with Josh McDaniels?
I'm not really sure. It sounds to me from people that I've talked to that like he has a lot of strong interest around the league, or has a lot of options, including possibly with Ben Johnson, who he has a relationship with. I will say me personally, I was pretty underwhelmed when Vrabel was asked, I think it was on EEI, about the list, and they asked him, like, Josh McDaniels. He's like, is Josh McDaniels on the list? Like, yeah. Like, I don't know. I found that it's a little offensive. I mean, he knows the guy. He knows how successful he's been. Like, say something a little bit more, Bill. Like, I'd love to talk to Josh at some point. It's been a while since we talked, but obviously his resume speaks for himself. So hopefully we get a chance to connect here in the next couple of days, just something like that. But to just be like, yeah, I don't know if that would go over so well. But we'll have to see. I mean, again, it's quite possible that Vrabel, like, I don't know, went home for a couple of days and was coming back to really hit the ground running. I do think this is going to be a pretty long process. And plus, I do think the playoffs complicate things. And, we're hearing about, some staff departures or, I got to tell Nick, first of all, I think the Patriots were ahead of the game with what they did in hiring Vrabel and how fast they did. Look at these other teams. Like, they're taking forever, and they're not going to be able to talk in person until next week with any of these people that are still live in the playoffs. And, whether they're going to be able to do that in person and stuff, and how complicated it's going to be. I mean, a lot of these guys, we might not hear about another hiring, unless you go outside of the NFL, like, Deion Sanders with the Cowboys or whatnot, for another couple weeks. I mean, say what you want about the Rooney Rule. I said, Kraft, we've talked about this before. Kraft knew what they wanted. They didn't waste anybody's time. And, and they got on with it, and they're going to be like 2 or 3 weeks ahead of everything. So, I just think all of this fallout from the hirings, like teams that have fired head coaches, the coaches are still under contract. Some of them let them out in interviews. Some of them don't. Like, it's pretty complicated. So this whole process has been dragged out by the National Football League.
The Jets have interviewed, I think this is a real number, I think they've interviewed 16 head coach candidates, and I think they've interviewed 15 GM candidates. That the 33rd team's making their money, folks. For the Jets, they're interviewing everybody. Greg might get a phone call tonight. A couple things. Vrabel, to me, about how he answered the McDaniels thing, part of me does wonder if he was just being coy. Because if you go too far, if you go too over the top, does he kind of, does he want to make it sound like McDaniels is the odds-on favorite? If he is the odds-on favorite, which pretty much everybody nationally is saying it's going to likely be McDaniels. So if Vrabel comes out and makes it sound like McDaniels is the guy, does he not get to talk to some other people because they go, oh, well, here we go, inside job.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So maybe he's being a little coy. The question I had for you, though, about the coordinator stuff, Greg, the Senior Bowl is on February 1st. Would it not be a good idea to have your staff, or at least most of your staff, in place by then, so you can start working, on the draft and free agency, and you've got to have those meetings with your coordinators and stuff to put pieces together, correct?
Yeah, I think we've sort of been basically that. You'll hear this a lot. I think it's completely overrated. That talk, like, football players are football players. They can and I think we've heard, even when they put together, I think Mayo's staff, I think we talked about this before, and I think Elliot Wolf and other people were just like, look, we can retrofit anything we want, after the fact. And plus, you have Ryan Cowden there. So he knows what Vrabel wants and is looking for. So yeah, it used to be a bigger deal. It's not as much anymore, especially with the length of the hiring process. Before we get to DC talk, any other OC names that you want to throw out there, or we're good to move on? No. I did a column today for BSJ, sort of, no inside, knowledge or anything like that. Just sort of going through some of Vrabel's history. I got to say that overall, and talking to people who were around Mike or worked with Mike in Tennessee, I'm pretty scared about him staffing, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I don't think it was very good in Tennessee. I mean, you know, LaFleur, from what I understand, was more of a John Robinson hiring. I think Arthur Smith, they just sort of, I mean, he had been there for a while. It's not like Vrabel had, interviewed all these guys and, went to Arthur Smith. I think, he was basically the next man up, and he did that. That was really good for them. I think it was it Tim Kelly who was next after Arthur Smith?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the stuff that I'm worried about. Like him going with guys he knows. Like Tim Kelly is not a good offensive coordinator. Todd Downing, not a good offensive coordinator. Like, but these guys are like Vrabel guys. Like, is he going to be like he needs to knock this thing out of the park, especially, it's one thing to hire these coordinators when you have, whether it's Marcus Mariota or Ryan Tannehill, veterans who have, you're not really going to change that much. We're talking about a 22, 23-year-old franchise quarterback in Drake May. Like, he needs to knock this out of the park. And guys like Tim Kelly and Todd Downing, who don't know anything about the quarterback position, are not going to be they're not going to be any good. I remember Tim Kelly, I think he was with the Texans. There was another guy, Pat O'Hara, that was there with Billy O'Brien. He was sort of like an underling. Vrabel doesn't hire the offensive line very well. Like, that's been a disaster. Like, he needs to go out and get real talented people. And it's a shame. But Nick, I just realized this. Remember last year, or no, it was Belichick's last year. And, Billy O'Brien came and, we were like, oh, is Bill going to let him hire his own staff and stuff like that? And they ended up going with Adrian Clem at offensive line. And I was like, why don't they just let him go get Mike Devlin, who's assistant offensive line coach for the Jets, who Billy O'Brien had in Houston? I said, go get that guy. And I just looked him up the other day because I was like, oh, maybe O'Brien might be like, oh, Vrabel, you should look at, remember Mike Devlin? Go look at him. He's been the Chargers offensive line coach. Like, Jim Harbaugh hired him and did a pretty good job this year. It's just like Vrabel can't make those kinds of mistakes, not with Drake May right now. So, I mean, I'm hopeful that it's Josh McDaniels. I don't feel great about that right now, but it better not be one of these like retread guys like Tim Kelly or, Justin Outen, who's the Titans tight ends coach. I don't want Nick Caley, no QB experience. I don't want Mike LaFleur, no QB experience, even though I think he got a bum rap in New York with the Jets with Saleh. I'm hopeful that they bring in like a guy like Clint Kubiak. Josh McCown, I like the idea of that, but he's never called plays. He's never been an offensive coordinator. I mean, he's been an NFL QB and he's coached QBs for 2 years, has a relationship with Drake May. That's good, but does he know anything about coordinating an offense? I don't know. I think Dave Ragone, the Rams QB coach, could be interesting, but another guy who's never called plays or done the job by himself. When he was offensive coordinator for Arthur Smith in Atlanta, Arthur Smith called the plays. So, I would say out of the guys out there, if it's Clint Kubiak or Josh McDaniels, I'm fairly happy about that. Anybody else, I'm not going to be very happy.
So a couple things, a lot to unpack. Number one, my fault. Tim Kelly was after Todd Downing. Todd Downing was 21-22. Then Tim Kelly was 20-23. I don't know how much the absolute disaster of the quarterback situation impacted those guys. I do want to be somewhat fair and say they had nothing to work with at quarterback. Tannehill, as 21-22 hit, he was really washed. They had Malik Willis. They had Will Levis. They just had a bunch of bleh. Blaine Gabbert was thrown in there. So, that does limit you. I'm not telling you those guys would be good. I don't know what they would look like with a better quarterback. They might be better. As far as Vrabel's role in all of this, I would hope he learned from Tennessee, his time in Tennessee. I would hope that he learned from his time in Cleveland, and he might approach this differently. I would hope that he evolves kind of his vision of, how to handle an offensive staff, how to find that offensive staff. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Clint Kubiak might be headed to Seattle. He has a second interview with the Seahawks. So it looks like the Seahawks are very likely well ahead of the game with Kubiak. So I think Kubiak is probably going to end up in Seattle. So it might be a safe thing to just kind of take him off the plate, which does go back to Vrabel. So if you were looking at Tommy Reese and Reese is now gone, maybe you were looking at Kubiak. Seattle got the jump on you for Kubiak. So, now you're looking at McDaniels. The name that you brought up, Ragone is interesting to me. I tweeted this days ago. If you're going to go with the first-time play caller, I would go with McCown because he's coached under Kevin O'Connell, who I have a lot of respect for. I think he's a very good coach, very good offensive coach. He has a pre-existing relationship with Drake May going back to high school. So I would imagine that would be a very, very easy transition for Drake May, somebody who knows May, somebody who has worked with May. So that relationship is very strong. And of course, he's a former quarterback and he has at least worked with quarterbacks the last couple of years. So to me, McCown is the guy. If you're going for the first-time play caller, I think McCown is very, very sexy. If you're going with the experienced guy, we've talked about it. I mean, McDaniels has to be at or near the top of your list.